So I am going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Schmucker, and I am the Director for Aerospace and Defense Solutions Consulting for Siemens, and I will be moderating the session. Welcome and thank you for attending our 50th in a series of ACE seminars, where it is important, of course, to attend and share within the community of technical experts for everyone to achieve higher levels of excellence. ACE has become the virtual forum to share user-based tips and techniques, what's new, and just general solution usage. Our goal is to further user practices by sharing targeted solution content to support you. This session will last 60 minutes, with the last 10 minutes targeted at your questions and other FAQs. You can post questions in the Q&A area within the WebEx web browser, and we will do our best to answer those at the end of the session. Also, you will be in listen-only mode and only able to see and chat with the Siemens panelists. If you use full screen mode in WebEx, it will yield the best viewing experience. This session is being recorded, so please reach out to your account team with any follow-up or to receive a copy of this session for distribution within your own organization. If you do not know your Siemens account manager, you can contact Shar Baker, whose email was in the invite, and can be contacted by that email address where she will properly direct your inquiry. So now let me introduce our topic for today, which is supply chain integration using digital rights management. This session will present and demonstrate common use cases for advanced data security techniques to protect data and intellectual property while closely collaborating with the supply chain. This will be covered by the men of the hour, Jim Sanford and Jim Conrad. Jim and Jim have a combined experience within engineering and collaboration totaling over 60 years with emphasis in security, networking, and databases. This makes them the perfect presenters for today's topic. So with that, you can please take it away, Jim and Jim.
Hey, you guys. Hey, it's Jim Sanford calling. So today we're going to talk a little bit about digital rights, and we'll do a brief introduction. We'll talk about some architecture. We'll go through a couple of use cases, and then we'll demonstrate those things. So what you're going to hear about is this thing called SkyDRM. And SkyDRM is analogous. They're the same thing as Teamcenter DRM. TcDRM and SkyDRM are the same product. What they do is they provide protection for data that's on the move, and they provide you a means to share through an extended enterprise, secure and protect important information. Now, that information can take place against any kind of file. So it can be CAD files, JT files, things like that that we're familiar with, as well as the common tools that we use during the day, right? PDFs, Word documents, PowerPoints, Excel, that kind of stuff. And we do that across multiple, let's call them bedrock ecosystems, right? Teamcenter is one of those. SAP is another. SharePoint, of course, things like Box, Dropbox, OneDrive, etc. All of your companies use those tools periodically. Today, we're generally going to focus on the PLM stack and the Teamcenter piece in particular. But realize that once you've assembled this protection envelope around this data, it can be accessed now on any device, whether that's an iOS device or a Google Android or Mac or Windows device or whatever browser you'd like. And the fundamental tenets behind it are this notion of data classification, the way that you understand the, let's call it the value of pieces of data. Different data has different value, right? Though it's underpinned by a notion of auditing and monitoring and policy management, such that these rights, these digital rights, if you will, become automated, and they're a way to protect data in a transparent way from users. Go ahead, Jim. So one of the reasons this has come about since about 2015, the changing business requirements have been addressed because of complexity. So identity is becoming less well known. The application landscape is expanding. Data is proliferating at a level that we've never seen before, and there are more devices than ever. So this notion of cloud this notion of remote workforce and work from home, the idea that you're going to bring your own device to your work is here to stay. They're not going to change, and we have to stomach the fact that we have to address them, right, while we share securely, right? So we approach protecting information using an attribute-based policy engine that spans creation, storage, usage, sharing, and monitoring of activities around intellectual property. Go ahead, Jim. So let's talk about the architecture, so that you guys are the smart guys on the phone. So SkyDRM, aka TcDRM, is an application stack that has a rich, fine-grained integration into the Teamcenter side of your business. So as you interact using any of the Teamcenter user interfaces, whether it's Active Workspace, Client, or RAC, or NX, or things like Creo, SolidWorks, etc., our integration provides transparent protection for assets regardless of your user interface choice. And then third, another interesting observation is that if you don't happen to go through Teamcenter and you choose to consume information from outside of a Teamcenter UI, you can use the SkyDRM applications directly burrowing into that TcDRM stack. You see them there. There's a SkyDRM desktop, there's a desktop web app, there's a desktop mobile app, etc. Now, the notable thing about this picture and this architecture is what's on the right-hand side. You realize that that same SkyDRM / TcDRM stack could be applied to any other repository or other enterprise applications, other bedrocks, if you will. So let's say you deploy TcDRM and you aim it at your Teamcenter stack, but you also want to protect a box volume that you might have out on the web, right? You can easily do that. Similarly with Dropbox and others, as I mentioned before. And most of the folks on this call in the aerospace industry know about SAP and use it widely. And the good news for you guys is that our other OEM partner outside of Siemens is SAP. So the same SkyDRM stack can be aimed at all of those bedrock applications to provide data protection across the ecosystem. You can do this. It's a common question. How does this happen, right? You can do it manually. You can simply navigate to a part inside of Teamcenter and right-click and say protect. Or you could do it via workflow, whether there's some particular workflow you need encryption to occur in, whether it's a supply chain workflow or whatever. Or you could do it in batch mode. You can simply say everything inside of this program must be protected every night, and that's that. So the way that happens is that a user might create some tech data package and right-click and say, please protect. What happens is that file and metadata are sent to the rights management service called SkyDRM, TcDRM, and security is applied to the file, and then it's slipped back into the Teamcenter stack right where it was. The only thing that you'll note if you were to do that is that there'll be a small green check mark next to the artifacts that you've protected. And then at any future time, if that file is either downloaded or shared or sent via Supply Chain Foundation or used in some way in your supply chain, that encryption goes along with the data. It goes whistling along, and that little green check mark is next to it the whole time. And as that user on the far end opens the file with some application, the data phones home, and it phones back to that SkyDRM stack, and it asks the question, hey, does this person have the rights to open or not open? Is it access or deny? Simple yes, no. And if yes, what rights can I apply to that file as I open it? And then the file is open for the application. So we've been able to track and catch who opened it, where they opened it, what, and then apply what rights they had to it as we do this process. Go ahead, Jim. So one of the things that you that are used in doing this are the attributes that are part of out-of-the-box Teamcenter. So there's 120 some odd user attributes that are assigned with an out-of-the-box Teamcenter installation, and those attributes are accessible to our policy engine for creating the data access. Okay, So in the case today, we're going to happen to be using IP classification simply because it's common and it's used in export control. But it could be these examples and the use cases you'll see today could be using any of these attributes that are out of the box with Teamcenter. Go ahead, Tim. Go ahead, Jim. So using attributes in a policy is pretty straightforward. It's a Boolean operation, essentially. It takes subject attributes, that's you as a user. It takes the environment attributes, the actual physical environment attributes, and it takes the resource attributes. Whoops, go back one, please. There you go. And it takes the resource attributes from the actual artifact you're trying to protect. And you simply apply a Boolean logic to it. I want to allow visualization and sharing and changing or downloading to some information in some criteria by users who are located here and have the following stamp. So it's very straightforward setting those policies up, and it's obviously quite simple from a Boolean perspective. And then NextLabs, TcDRM, decides what action to take. If we allow, yes, no, and then we say, let's let them visualize, change, download, extract, save as, etc. Right? Reshare. So, and you'll see many of those use cases today. Go ahead, Jim. So the way that it does that is that it grabs the file and the metadata associated with the file, and it wraps it in a wrapper called a .nxl wrapper. So it has both the payload and the metadata associated with it using an AES 256 encryption method, and that .nxl file becomes the artifact we're now using and interacting with. Go ahead, Jim. So we mentioned IP classification. What you can now imagine is that is just another way to do regulatory compliance. So whether you are dealing with ITAR, EAR, OFAC, NRC, etc., those are simply a set of rules that each of those people require for your compliance. So in the case of the A&D industry right now, CMMC is the new rage, and it's basically mandatory for 2021. The only way that you can get to level 3 CMMC compliance inside of your Teamcenter environment is by using NextLabs, right? So by in some way protecting the information as it sits at rest. So that is done. These are simple policies, like ITAR policies are based on export control licenses and the people associated with them. Go ahead, Jim. So think about it this way. You've got this regulatory compliance problem that's facing you, whether it's ITAR or CMMC or what have you, and you've got a policy that can be written against that regulatory body, and you have an evaluation location. That's all SkyDRM. The policy management and policy evaluation are the SkyDRM piece that we're talking about today. The enforcement point, where the actual user interface would make decisions for a certain user being able to access or not access data, is done there at Teamcenter. That's the policy enforcement point, the PEP. And the cool thing about what we offer through this, go ahead, Jim, is that that same policy evaluation and policy management engine can be applied to other Bedrock applications. So once deployed, TcDRM can be applicable to other application stacks. Okay, continue. So I'm going to hand over to Jim now. Jim's going to talk about some use cases, and we'll be sitting here watching the chat for questions, all right? I'll go on mute.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Hello, everybody. Jim Conrad. Good afternoon to all. So just a couple examples before we go into the actual demo segment of it. So these are typical things that we've seen out there as far as collaboration. Jim mentioned a little bit before, where you have data that you need to secure across the internet, and it needs to be any type of data. It could be, again, it could be CAD information, you're looking at assembly or a part or whatever, but it could also be documents. So here, where we have an engineer that has a file, he needs to protect it and collaborate. This is back to the policy where we do this fine grain policy authorization and limit it on a need to know. So, and the data is encrypted. So this way, when the user accesses it, they either are denied or allowed, and possibly allowed with restrictions. So it controls the content for the life of the time it is actually encrypted. Here's this typical scenario in an engineering collaboration where you have the securing supplier or the supplier needing to look at information, and in this case, it's secured by NextLabs through Teamcenter. It goes through SkyDRM, as Jim mentioned, which is just our platform for doing the encryption piece of it, looking at the policies, applying the specifics for the metadata that then is used in policy to go against. And then when the supplier opens it, there could be a couple choices. If they don't have the actual Creo tool, in this case, they might just use our SkyDRM desktop viewer to actually view the content that was delivered to them. Or if they have, in this case, the Creo piece, then it would open up in the native tool protected there. So we have solution components, as it shows on the bottom left, that you can introduce into your environment as needed in order to cover your wide base of users that might be looking at this information. Again, as Jim mentioned earlier, this is similar to what we talked about before, where we have this workflow. So it goes back to those two use cases that we just showed earlier when Jim went through this, where it tags and encrypts it, the file is secure, and then if a user has the ability, it can open that file. So let's go into the demo. So the demo in this segment is going to cover 3 different types of common use cases that we have seen and come across over and over again. One is the extended enterprise, in which case you have users at different locations, but they all have the same email address. So you work for, acme.com. You're in different locations, possibly different locations in the world, and you need to share information. So it's within company, but it's in different locations. So that's an extended enterprise example. The second one we'll look at will be the supply chain collaboration. So this is where you have an enterprise that needs to share with its third-party suppliers and vendors. So in this case, it's more of a collaboration of a share and reshare of information. And then the last one we'll look at, and what Jim talked about at the end, is if you have any type of regulatory compliance. In this particular example, we're using ITAR, but it could be anything else as far as what you need to do to be within the compliance. The other one that Jim talked about later on, the CMMC one, which is going to be required for 2021. So let's go through the first one. So this is a video demo that I shot. So the only thing that you're going to notice different is that I'm going to actually talk live as opposed to you listening to me go through this particular demo. So here we're going to start off by talking about the extended enterprise solution that I mentioned earlier on. So this is where we're going to have, I believe, 3 different areas within a company that we're going to take a look at within this extended enterprise. So here we have Acme US, we have an offshore center in India, as well as an outsourced partner in China. And they all are working on a transmission assembly. So in this particular case, the US headquarters owns the data, has all the access rights to it, but they want to outsource the transmission case to Acme China, and then India LLC will be able to look at the control subassembly of the transmission. So each area has its own particular role. The company, the users at the bottom that will be used in the classification are key to what's going to be used within policy to actually make decisions based on those classifications, who the users are and their location, to allow them access to all of the information or some of the information when they receive the transmission assembly. So based on policy decision that we were talking about, that's where the fine grain authorization takes place for either Ed, Jin, or Sandeep, or Ping, or Steve, or Sanjay to access the information. So it's the same assembly, but based on that policy, we'll give each one of them a different effect as far as what they can actually look at when they go to access it. Here we're taking a look at Active Directory, where the users are being are actually using for authentication. Here we see Ed from the United States, we see Steve, we see Sanjay. It shows the company and the country. So these are some of the subject attributes that we were talking about earlier that are used within policies to make the decision on that side of it. On the other end of it will be what we're going to use as far as the document. So here's our SkyDRM admin screen. This is where you'll see those domain policies that can be set up for use. In this case, we're first going to show the user mapping. So first we're going to map the attributes of what we have in policy. So we have citizenship, department license, security, country of affiliation. So these are ones that we happen to select in this particular list for this policy that we're going to, or policies that we'll create. We want to use those particular attributes. Again, it can vary by organization. Here we show where we map those attributes. So what we're calling citizenship maps to the letter C within Active Directory, country of affiliation, division, department, so on and so forth. So it's all about SkyDRM just knowing what you want to use in order to create what it's going to use as far as resources are concerned. In this case, here's the IP classification that Jim mentioned earlier. So we have public, confidential, classified, and then the CCI 101 and 2 in that we showed earlier on within the beginning of the use case. So these are the different policies. You can see that they are deployed. So it's a centrally managed policy engine. So as Jim mentioned earlier, this way it can be used for multiple reasons or multiple items, not just necessarily your stuff within Teamcenter, but also if you have a Word doc or a PDF or whatever it might be that makes up the entire package of what the collaboration is. So here we'll see Ed, who works for Acme US, signing into the SkyDRM itself. Once he's logged in, he's on his desktop. At this point, Ed's going to sign into Teamcenter. So his SkyDRM desktop is going to be in communication with the actual backend platform, which will look at those policies that we saw what we set up for. And now he's within Teamcenter. He's an engineering designer. We'll see that this information is loaded. There's the transmission we talked about earlier. Right, so if we can expand some of these drop downs, take a look at different pieces. In this case, we're going to look at a nut and show that the property for that, right, if we scroll down, we'll see that the IP classification is the CCI-102, which was one of our attributes we used for resource within policy. And here, when we look at the structure manager, we will see that it'll show all the different components and parts and what the IP classifications are for each of these selected parts as it's been deemed, within the organization to be classified as. Here we can see NextLabs can protect this information. So again, once the Teamcenter part's installed, it's a seamless interaction between Teamcenter and the features available within there to protect or unprotect those files. So here we'll see that in this case, Ed wants to open it up in the NX client, and we'll see the entire transmission, right? He's the owner of the data. And in this case, you don't see anything grayed out on the left-hand side. And looking at the transmission, we can see that you can see the entire assembly of it. Here we can look at the rights that's applied to it. So in this case, when he opens that up, you'll get to see what the capabilities are, as Jim mentioned earlier, where you can set it up, in this case, view print, save as, export, and it'll show ones that are not protected as well. So in some circumstances, you might have, parts that are not proprietary. You may not need to have to protect them, right? So in this case, we're going to export this as a JT file. In this example, it could be exported as pretty much anything that you want to use. But again, it's going to have the NXL extension on it, as you can see on the type, right? So if you go down, it looks as an NXL file. Here we can go through SkyDRM and do a file info. So this will tell us what rights are applied to it based on this file that was downloaded to, in this case, is local drive. This could have been in Box or within SharePoint or any other of these other locations, if that's where you would put the info out to. Again, we can see view, print, reshare, and what it's classified at. So here's a common scenario where Ed's going through and making sure that based on the policy he's got applied to this, that it's applied correctly for users that are going to access it. So now Jin is going to sign in. Remember, Jin is from China, and Jin is going to sign into SkyDRM himself. We're going to look at that same transmission. Right, so it's under that same CAD folder. And in this case, he's going to view the file. So when it tries to open up in the SkyDRM viewer, what you're going to see is just the case, right? So he has a full view of the transmission case, but you notice there's no subassembly. So in this case, he's been restricted because he doesn't need to see that particular part of that overall transmission. He can also, since he has full rights to the engine case itself, he can go in and look at all the individual pieces separately. So here he can look at the main body of the case, right? Has full control over looking at that. And if he had rights to it to make modifications or changes, he would also be able to do that as well. But again, he has no idea, there's a subassembly. Here we can go in through unmanaged mode. So here he's not connected to a Teamcenter instance. In this case, it's going to load up. And again, now you'll see that those are the ones they can't open. So all of those ones that were listed and that you see in the gray on the left-hand side are all protected files within that assembly that he can't look at. And they're all pretty much the subassembly pieces or parts that you can't see. The ones he can see, he can uncheck if he wants to break it down into pieces, as I mentioned earlier, if he only wants to look at segments of that assembly. Again, he can look at the rights of the file. And in this case, you're going to see that there are only a certain number of files, unlike the list you saw that Ed had, to be able to look at. So in this case, the TcDRM interfacing with the SkyDRM policies gave him his view. Now Sanjay from India is going to take and log on to the desktop of SkyDRM. Again, same file. He'll look at the file through the viewer. And what Sanjay is going to see through the SkyDRM viewer should be much different than what Jin saw. So in this case, he just sees the subassembly that's part of the transmission. Again, he'll go in through unmanaged mode, open that same 0072. And here we'll see the subassembly, and now he gets a list of parts that he's not able to open. In this case would be all the transmission case pieces that are part of that. So same exact assembly, but two different user views of what they can and can't see. And again, he has the same ability to uncheck different pieces if he doesn't want to look at certain parts of that subassembly. And here we can go in and view the file. So he showed it in unmanaged mode, and now we're going to show it in the SkyDRM viewer. So if he doesn't happen to have a desktop tool to look at, he can use our viewer to look at that assembly. So that's the extended enterprise capabilities. In our next segment, what we're going to talk about here is data share and reshare control. So this is where you have a multi-tier supply chain where not necessarily the users work for the same company. In most cases, they do not. They're subcontractors. They could be tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, outside vendors. And you want to be able to have your data go to certain locations and know with confidence that that information that you're sending is going to be protected. And you don't have to worry that if for some reason, somebody downloads a file and then decides it's a good idea to send it to somebody else within their organization and types in the wrong email address and that person receives it that shouldn't get it, that they can't open it. Because if they're not part of this, it's an encrypted file. They won't be able to see anything as far as that goes. So let's start up this demo here to take a look at this scenario with the data share and reshare. So here we have Ed, he's the project owner. We have Ross, who's a tier 1 contractor, and we have Claudine, who's a subcontractor of Ross's. So in this case, again, Ed has full control of the data and the data chain itself, and then the other two will be able to access the information. So back to classification access is the same as we saw before. The roles are a little different for these users because we have Ed, Ross, and Claudine, and each one has a specific project area that they're working on. So a lot of times within the supply chain space, this is broken down into more of a project level scenario. So this could be where information is out of Teamcenter, put into Box or SharePoint or OneDrive, and now the main user, Ed, is having his users access this, or in this case, his contractors, or in this case, a subcontractor is accessing it through one of those repositories, but through a project within SkyDRM. So SkyDRM is your main control point for any of these users to access it, no matter what the backend is that's holding the information. So here we'll see that Ed's going to sign on to SkyDRM again. And now we're presented with the project view, or in this case, the SkyDRM view. So he can see all of these different projects that he's part of. So he is the engine transmission 100, bearings, forks, cases, so on and so forth. And there are different users that we're seeing here that are part of that. So here we have Ed and Steve within the engine bearing. We can go in and look at the engine cases, in which case we have Ed and Ross, who we talked about at the beginning. So here, in this case, we have the engine transmission 100 project, and he has 3 different sets of folders. In there, he has the transmission itself, and he has files that are in there. In this case, he can look at the information. It's a JT file, classification to CCI 103, different rights available for that file. He can go in and share a file. He can look at information of other files as well that are in there. But in this case, what he wants to do is actually go out and do a share of that file. So he'll go in and take a look at the different projects that he can share it with. So in this case, he's going to share it with the engine case project. And in that scenario, he's actually the he's the owner, but he's going to share it out. So here we can see already, once it's protected and once he shares it, we start having an activity log. So the important thing to note here is that when you start with the encryption and then the sharing, any activity that's gone on with that file is then being captured. So you can see what's gone on with your data. So here Ross is going to sign in, right? You can see he only can see 2 projects now. In this case, he's in engine cases. He'll see what was shared. We'll see that, you know, in this case, Ed shared that a moment ago with him. He can go out, take a look at the information. Again, has full rights to this file because that's what's been deemed in policy as far as allowing the user access to it. Here, he'll go out and he'll actually want to share that with his subcontractor. So in this case, since he's the project leader of that particular project, he can then go out and reshare that again, in this case with Claudine. All right, so now Claudine, who's part of that, as we can see, is a member. He can go out, see that he shared that area because he's part of that project as well, along with Lewis is another member of that particular project. So now at this point, he's happy he sent that off. Claudine's now going to go out. She'll take a look at this when she signs into SkyDRM. In this case, she only can see that project, so she's only part of that one project. And here we'll see that there is, you know, Claudine, Lewis, and Ross, as we showed before when Ross signed in. And now when we look at the shared file, there's only one listed for her. And in this case, it's that case that was sent on between Ed, Ross, and now down to her. So at this point, she's not going to be resharing it any longer. Even if she wants to, she can, but it's at the point where it's reached the end of the chain, and she's now just going to open it because she's the one that actually needs to take a look at this. So in this case, she's going to open it up within the SkyDRM viewer. And here we'll see that it shows the transmission case, and she can spin it around and take a look at it from all different angles. So at this point, we've completed the pass down of what users are going to look at and share. So Ed's going to go back in. He's again your main user in the enterprise that has shared this information out to begin with. So in this case, he's decided to go out and actually look at that file. Here he can look at the log, and now we'll see that there's a lot more activity. Protect, share, reshare, view multiple times, right? So this also comes in very handy where we're in the position that's Ed's in, is that if you have a revision history, right, or a revision that's going to change, at this point, Ed's going to revoke rights to the file. So you might have a cutoff date of the 1st of a month, and he can go in and actually update that so that you won't have permissions to access that. So even though Ross was the resharer to Claudine, since he's the overall owner of the data, that is now cut off all the way down the line. So now when we go out and take a look in the engine cases file, you'll see that the transmission is gone. The file is now gone. So now we'll go in as Ross, who is part of that particular project. And when he goes in engine cases, just like we saw from Ed, we'll see that that file is now gone, right? So he's no longer shared that transmission case. And now we'll go do the same with Claudine. And here is a subcontractor. As we saw before, under the shared, there was one file and now there's none. Right. So here we have a scenario where we can have multiple users view the file, access the file, have certain rights to the file. And in the end, ultimately, the owner of the file from the origin can turn around and do a revocation on that so that they can't view it any longer. We have seen many customers ask about, what happens when a revision changes, and we want to make sure everybody stays in sync. And this is a common example and scenario where, you can guarantee to make sure that that file from your revision 1 is no longer used since you've moved on, so that you don't have incompatibilities between revision 1 and 2 that you've now moved on to. So that concludes our second scenario. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the file access control, in this case, the compliance for ITAR. So here you have to have a set of criteria in order for you to access a particular file based on a license. So the problem that you run into is that you need to share this securely. Our solution allows users, both US and non-US, to access those ITAR files securely. So depending on who you are and your location, in this case, we have Ed, Steve, Hal, and Ross, 2 from the US, Hal from the UK, with a ITAR license of TA01, and Ross from France with TA02. Depending on those attributes and who you are, will dictate what you'll be able to see. So again, we're back to looking at the user attributes here. License is equated to within our Active Directory. So this way we have a correlation between our mappings for user attributes. So when the policy makes the decision dynamically, it can apply the proper tags to it for what they can and can't see, or rights to what they can and can't see on that particular file. Again, we'll go down and look at classification, but this time we'll go a little farther. This time we've added is jurisdiction. So it could be ITAR, EAR, or none. So if it's classified as none, then that's a public file. None of it needs to apply. So here we can see where we have different policies. Again, very easy to read, easy to create for different users and what it actually applies to. So anybody coming in here can just read what it says and then go through and actually see the logic that's going to flow based on that policy. So here we can go down. We'll have, again, user information and resources. Here in this case, the resource, if it's jurisdiction of EC ITAR, and in this case, it has an EC license of TAA01. Then when we go down to the subject or the people resource, you have to be, the citizen is not in the US and the license has to be equal to that TA01. So here we have a matchup of values to make decisions, and then what they can do with it. They can view, print, reshare, whatever is being set up within the policy itself. Now back at the thing, we can actually look at, in this case, allow US person, in this case it's EAR, even though we won't be showing that, it's just to show a different example of a policy where, if the jurisdiction is EC EAR and the user in this case is a citizen of the United States, then they have full access to the file. So those are the rights that are applied. So just to give you a different flavor and example of what you can do. And this is a US person with a US employer access to EC/ITAR documents. So again, jurisdiction is EC/ITAR. And here we have a few different things to set. So in this case, it is United States. The department is not a supplier, but it is in the country affiliation is US. And then you have full rights to it. And the reason that's important is because we're going to show within here that you could be within the US, but if you're a supplier, you're still treated differently than if you were not. So here we'll see Active Directory, and this relates back to what we talked about earlier, where we can look at attributes. Here we'll see add United States, right? There's no license needed because he's a US employee. Here we'll see Hal. Again, Hal is from the UK. So if we scroll down, we're going to see he has a license of TAA01. If we look at Steve, he's yet another US employee. In this case, it's going to be similar to Ed. You won't see anything listed. Right? There's no license listed for him because it's not needed. And then we're going to take a look at Ross. And in this example, Ross is from France, right? And he's got a license of TAA02. So all of these attributes are all set, looked at, and compared, at the time of the access to the encrypted file. So now we'll see after the policies are set, we'll go in as Ed. And again, we're going to show this in a local mode as opposed to, file system volume or whatever it could be stored in. Here we'll look at a PDF, right? So in this case, the PDF file itself, protected, we're doing company protection. We're going to have an EC none because it's a PDF. And then it has full rights to it based on that. So that's the protection based on that PDF. The next thing we'll look at is a JT file. In this case, it's a connecting rod. We're going to protect this file. But in this particular case, we're going to select and scroll down and take an EC/ITAR jurisdiction and then that TAA01 license. So those are the two things it's now going to be looking for based on those attributes. And then the 1057 JT file will also protect that. In this case, we're going to pick, again, EC/ITAR, but the license will be the TAA02. And again, full rights if you have the ability to look at them. So now they're created, you'll see that the three of them within that protected folder, we just put it in to make it easy to separate out, is an NXL file. So it'll show the rights that are listed. Again, these are all the rights that Ed has come up with for the files. Make sure that he's got the license, the jurisdiction, and everything set up the way he wants based on what he's applied to it. And everything goes according to plan. He has everything set according to what he's wanting to specify. He can now open it within the player. So in this case, it's going to open it within the JT2Go. And now we can look at that connecting rod assembly within the JT2Co application.
Yeah,
And now
so
he's going.
Jim, if you
Yep.
don't mind, let me pipe in right there. So everybody on
Sure.
the phone, don't forget that the JT2Go is just one viewer. If you had VisView Standard or VisView Pro or Vis Mockup or any of the others, any of the TC Viz stuff, it'll all open just the same.
Yep. Thanks, Jim. All right, so here's our second file. In this case, it happens to be a roller bearing that opens up for the 1057 part. And then our last one that he wants to take a look at, in this case, the PDF, will open up. And again, it's got a watermark in it. In this case, we're using the date, time, and his email address. So Ed's happy with what he's done for the 3 files that he's protected, given the criteria and attributes that he wanted to use. And again, he can also go in and look at the connecting rod through our viewer. So as Jim mentioned, you could look at through multiple viz tools. You could also use just our standard SkyDRM viewer if you wanted. All right, we're now going to log in this case, as a different user. Right. So here we'll log in as Steve. So Steve's a US employee. In this case, Steve should end up having the same rights as Ed since he's a US employee, in which case he does. So he has full rights to look at that file, even though there was a ITAR license attached to it. In this case, TA01 on this one. And he can see all 3 of those, just like Ed did. So what's expected and what he's seeing is exactly what the outcome should be. Now, if we log out as Steve, and in this case, we're going to log in as Hal this time. Same 3 files, but in this case, when he goes to look at the file info, this is full access. Again, this is the EC None, so this is a common file that anybody can see publicly. Here, when he looks at this, you'll notice he only has view capabilities, and that's because he has the TA01 license. When he tries to open up the 1057, he can't even open it. It's all grayed out. He doesn't have the right license associated with that file to open it. If we now log back in as Ross, again, same files. Again, full access to the PDF. Again, it's a public file. There's no jurisdiction specified on this file. So he has full access. Now we should see the reverse. So here we'll see he has no access to the connecting rod that Hal could see. And in this case, the 1057, he does have access to because he has the right TA02 license that can be used to view this particular file. So as far as the export control, it's doing what it's supposed to based on the user's license and attributes associated with that. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to go into Active Directory and we're going to get rid of the license value for Hal. So what this is to show is that the policies don't change, but one value for a user, in this case of Active Directory, changes. And when that user logs back in through SkyDRM desktop, the outcome for what they can see can be changed. So unlike the use of roles or access control lists, using dynamic attributes gives you the ability to, on the fly, by changing an attribute within the user identity store, you can see that now he can see the PDF, but he can't see the connecting rod, which he could see before. And he also still can't see the 1057 roller bearing. So the attribute's gone, the policy doesn't evaluate to allow him access, so he's denied. So it would also work if a user was able to, or switches departments. They work in a department, they end their department on Friday, it'd start a new department on Monday. You change an attribute in here for the department that they're in, and then those policies would be applied to those particular files that they can gain access to. So now we'll see when Hal goes back in, he can now view the connecting rod because we put this license back in. And in this case, he can't view the 105.7.1. So very powerful for user access. The last user we're going to see within our demo here is the one I didn't mention earlier, which is Max. He's a supplier. So we'll see that he is a department supplier. So if you remember from the beginning, the supplier was somebody that is a US-based person, right? But restricted access to the ITAR documents, right? So we actually have a policy that takes into account if it's a US employee, but not, but a supplier. So here, when Max logs in, his outcome is very different. So he'll see, in this case, the PDF, same as the others, since it's a public file with a jurisdiction of EC none. But here, when he goes out and looks at the connecting rod, you'll see that he can see the file info, but this case, he's only can see it via view, and it'll have a watermark on it, right? And the same thing will hold true for the 105.7 part. So based on that attribute of supplier, changes up his ability to access different files and what he can actually see with those files. And I believe that concludes my demonstration for our 3 use cases. I think the last thing we're going to see is him actually opening it up within the viewer. And you'll see that in this case, it'll be watermarked. And here we have the connecting rod, and it's now watermarked in the background. So he can access it, but he's limited as far as what he can see.
Yeah, that's excellent, Jim. Thanks very much. So,
yep.
Steve and everybody, we're that's the end of the material that we've got. We do have a couple of questions though. So one from Karen Tellier from GD Land Systems Canada. Great question. Can the data be shared as part of a Teamcenter workflow, not just exported from X? Absolutely, yeah. The data can be shared via workflow, transparent of user intervention. In your case, I would imagine maybe it has to do with material going across the border from Sterling Heights to London. But yeah, Karen, that's easily managed.
Yep. It could also be approval in the process of the workflow as well, and protected or unprotected, whatever the needs are across the board.
So another question. No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, great question.
Yeah. So another question was about the type of files that can be protected. The DRM platform is file type agnostic. What the integration with Teamcenter provides, though, is for fine-grained usage control, as you saw, edit, save, print, extract, for all of the assets that are sitting inside of Teamcenter, transparent to users.
Okay, Jim, and I have another question here. Can this capability of DRM be used offline?
Yes, great question, and that definitely can happen. You could have a user where they're working on something and maybe they're on a plane, right? They don't have access to the system, so you can use it offline. If the data is protected and the client has the desktop SkyDRM desktop client, which I showed in the demonstration, and the file is actually put in local mode, there is a given period of time before that would expire that they could actually access and work on that file. And then it will resync up again with a project or back to Teamcenter once you're back online. So great question.
Okay. And I think the final question I'm seeing that rolled in, and I think you showed this, but maybe just to re-clarify, does DRM use attribute-based access controls?
Yes, that's the main part of our product, is to use attribute-based access control and not using access control lists or your standard ABAC roles where it was role based. So we can use attribute based as it's an enhancement or more of a fine grain than using those other 2 methods that have been around for a very long time. And as you can see within the demo, changing attributes can change the outcomes dynamically. So there's a big advantage there as far as using the attributes.
Yeah, I'll pile on to that, Steve. Access control lists we're all familiar with, and role-based access control, most of us are familiar with. But unfortunately, both being still useful, but they lack the ability to scale. And so the issue is, as you proliferate data and systems, you end up with a scalability issue with both of them. And the beauty of attribute-based access control is that, as Jim just mentioned, it's sort of more connected to the data than it is the people touching it. And if an attribute changes, it very quickly affects the access of a data stack. Versus if you have, a whole bunch of roles that you have to constantly pay attention to, you can get a mismatch between access and role. And we're finding that with our SAP clients. In fact, one of the compelling business drivers for the SAP side of our business is the role explosion that comes along with the non-linear scaling of ABAC.
Okay, excellent. I am showing we're clear of questions, so thanks for going to the last slide here. Everyone can take a look at some of the upcoming sessions that we have. Of course, you'll be receiving invitations to these. We look forward to presenting this capability later on in the month here. So with that, Jim and Jim, thank you for the presentation. It was truly excellent. And with that, we can go ahead and close out the session.
Peace,
You guys
everybody.
can go ahead and leave.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody's time. Have a
Okay.
good day.
Bye.